Secrets revealed. Nation was stunned by the sight of Damori. Unlike all the times they'd practiced and trained together, when she was free to discard her bindings and covers and feel both the warmth of the sun on her skin and the chilly breeze as it cooled the sweat on her shoulders and face, Damori stood fully covered in her cloak, veil, and hood. Not an inch of her ashen skin showed as she swung her sword angrily. She was embroiled in battle. Nasian noticed that her sword was still sheathed, revealing little intention of actually causing her adversary harm. This was a good thing because Damori was battling Nasian's son, Tanar. The metallic sound of each impact of their swords echoed in the air in a high-pitched rhythm as Tanar swung his jean hard and fast. Tanar was outmatched. He was breathing hard and swinging wildly as Damori easily parried his attacks with her sword. In return, she landed 2 powerful kicks to his chest, forcing his back against a tree. If their skirmish was a contest, Damori had already easily and very handily won. She struck simultaneously with her sword and her foot. Tanar blocked the sword and felt the hard thud of her heel planted into his upper thigh. His leg went numb and he fell backwards. Damori quickly moved closer, looming above him with her sword at his neck and her foot on his chest. "Do you yield?" she said softly. There was a rhetorical tone to her words, a formality of common courtesy. The battle was won. She'd beaten him. Now all he needed to do was to accept defeat. But there was something else afoot. Damori's soft, alto-pitched and very feminine voice had rocked Tanner's mind. He shook his head with disbelief and batted his eyes at her as he stared. He squared up on his elbows, pushing his back off the ground for a better angle. "Shall I repeat myself, villain?" Damori responded to the confusion in Tanner's eyes. Tanner squinted and sneered with disgusted disbelief. "This is a trick," he thought. "Small demon," Tanner shouted back, with the voice of a woman. "I do not yield." Damori unsheathed her sword and placed the edge of the blade against Tanner's jugular vein. "I am no demon," she retorted with unusual malice. She slammed her foot down against Tanner's chest and forced his back to the ground. There was an edge to her tone that made Nation's eyes widen. He'd never heard Damori speak with a malicious undertone. She tightened her grip on the sword's hilt, daring Tanar to make a move. "That is enough!" Nation bellowed as he stepped out of the brush into the clearing. Neshen glared at Tanar and Damori with abject disapproval. Damori shrunk under her gaze. Tanar did the exact opposite. He rebuffed Nation, shooting daggers with his eyes at the old man. "You are correct! This is undoubtedly enough," he yelled. Damori moved the edge of her sword from Tanar's neck and placed the point at his chest. "King Natian, this man was following you," she explained. "I intercepted him." Tanar shifted his gaze back to Damori, her voice still ringing in his ears. His incredulity gave way to anger, and he swiped at her blade, knocking it off his chest. "No," he shouted with embarrassment. "You cannot be a woman." Damori stepped back and prepared for his attack, but Tanar did not attempt to stand. He was awestruck as he surveyed her diminutive stature. Yes, she was smallish in size, but he sensed something else inside of her. For a brief moment, his anger and embarrassment gave way to curiosity as he leaned his head slightly and studied her again. "She is a young woman, as well as my student," Nation answered. Neshen turned to Damori. She'd already lowered her sword. "Damori," he started tepidly, "the young man before you who cannot believe you are a woman, and a lady, is my son." Damori did a double take at Tanar, and then quickly shifted her gaze between Tanar and Nasian. Her squared shoulders slumped as she stepped back and dropped her sword. "The Prince of Hangvuit, my lord," she stammered. "Prince Tanar, please forgive me for defeating you in contest." Tanar winced at the word, defeat, as Damori backed away. She dropped to a kneeling position and lowered her eyes as was proper in the presence of a prince. Tanar couldn't find the words to address what Damori had spoken, so he shifted his embarrassment to anger and turned back to King Nacien. "Father, is she the reason why you sneak out of the gates of Hangvit?" "Tanar, do not examine my deeds so. They are not done against you." "Not against me? You abandoned me," he pleaded, You have obviously given her training and discipleship, which rightfully belong to me. Tell me, what have I done to deserve such contempt from you?" Nacien quickly grew weary of the conversation. He knew exactly where it was headed. In his mind he agreed that perhaps he'd handled the matter of training Damaret incorrectly, but the greater motive of refusing to train Tana was the same. He had made a secret promise to his dying wife. Tana would not be trained in the technique that would place him on the battlefield. "Enough," Nacien said coldly and with finality. "Twisting Dagger is mine to give as I see fit. I am King Nacien. You will obey my orders forthwith. Leave me. Return home." Tanner was staggered by Nacien's outward indifference. He glared at his father, and Nacien glared back at him. Damori watched the stubborn men for a moment, each refusing to acquiesce. Then she saw the Tanner's expression change. It was as if his inner spirit died right before her eyes. The fire with which he fought her was gone. Nacien's rejection seemed to siphon Tanner's energy and let it waft in the air like a dissipating puff of smoke from a dying fire. Tanner slumped into deep dejection. He lowered his eyes and turned away. Twice today he'd been defeated. He could endure no more. He waited for a moment in silent prayer, hoping his dear king would find an ounce of sympathy and embrace him. No such gesture occurred. He turned his back to Nacien and started his long, lonely walk farther into the woods. Damori watched Tanner traipse away. She felt his pain and loneliness as if it were her own. She pulled her hood away and tugged her veil down as she made her way to Nacien. "King Nacien, for you I will train until my palms are raw. My legs ache and my feet swell around like dragon fruit. I do so because I love you and I cherish our time together. But he is your son. Do not deny him the honor of doing the same. Do not deny yourself the warmth of his love. The denial of love is an ugly thing, of which I have seen far too much. Please believe this." Nacien stared at Damori, marveling at her. As much as they'd trained together, he often took her beauty for granted. Her dark skin glowed, radiating a warm aura that surrounded her like air. The sun reflected off her caramel-colored eyes, giving her a glint that matched the brilliant whiteness of her teeth. Nacien had focused so much on Damori's remarkable physical skills that he'd forgotten how beautiful and wise she truly was. "Empress Shayla has trained you well, dearest," he said. Nacien held Damori's face between his wrinkled hands and smiled at her. She smiled back, warming his soul. He lifted the veil up over her face and pulled her hood over her head. Once more, not 1 inch of her skin was exposed. "Come to me, my son," Nacien said loud enough for Tana to hear. Tana returned quickly, with his gaze still fixed on the ground. "Yes, father," he mumbled. Nacien took Damori's hand and placed it in Tana's hand. Tana looked up and locked eyes with her. "From this day forward," Nacien began, "Tana, you and Lady Damori will learn Twisting Dagger together." Tanner kept his visual embrace with Damori as he watched the corners of her veil curl upwards. She was smiling underneath her lace mask. Tanner felt the twinge of curiosity again, and he couldn't help but offer a smile of his own. "Gather your swords," Nacien said as he marched in the direction of the jade veld. Tanner picked up Damori's sword and handed it to her. She bowed deeply, as was proper in the face of royalty, but she couldn't resist looking into his eyes and holding his gaze, despite knowing that such action was forbidden. Tanner didn't complain. When training was over and night had fallen, the supermoon hung so low that Damori thought someone who was strong enough could throw a rock and hit it square. She thought for a moment how silly of her to imagine such things, but she couldn't help but titter as she hid her sword and sheath in a hedgerow at the back of the barn. When she had securely covered it with loam and leaves, she walked through the garden to an entrance at the back dot. She crept through the hall toward the servants' quarters. At the door, she slipped her sandals off until her bare feet laid flat against the cold, hard dirt floor. She liked the feeling of cold grains between her toes. Night was one of the rare times she could sneak a part of her body from beneath her perpetual covering. At night, the men and women she encountered traveling on the road of the small town she adopted always held a lit torch or candlestick to see in the darkness. They were so preoccupied with finding their way through the darkness that no one ever looked down at her feet. As Damori took a moment to curl her toes against the dirt floor. The night was particularly cool and the dirt sent a bitter chill through her body. The shock gave her a start, and the sudden jerky movement of her body caused her to groan out loud. She realized that she was terribly sore from the day's training with King Nassian and Prince Tanner. Nation had been particularly thorough in demanding the two youngsters repeat every thrust and stance until their techniques were near perfect. Every muscle ached, but Damori grinned as she recalled swordplay and sparring with the prince. How different it was from sparring with the king! Tanner constantly locked eyes with her, studying her. It was more than a simple interest in the woman who'd easily beaten him at swordplay. He had a stark interest in the women beneath the suffocating cloak, hood, and veil. Although Nation never demanded it, Damori kept her body and flesh covered while she was sparing. She heard King Kaelin's voice in her head when she merely contemplated the idea of revealing herself. No. Tanner would have to study her as she was, covered from head to toe with not an inch of skin showing. She and Tanner sparred, but in many ways their practice was tantamount to childish horseplay. She caught herself giggling more than once, and she felt her knees buckle when Tanner flashed a handsome but arrogant smile at her. How ironic, she thought, that she, a servant, isolated from her own kingdom, would be invited to play with the king and prince of another kingdom. Damori welcomed the aches in her joints and the soreness in her muscles because it was a reminder of her time with Nassian, and now the pain gave her something more, a pleasant recollection of the prince, who was, in many ways, similar to her, in that they both suffered estrangement from their beloved emperors. She stumbled as she moved towards the ladder that took her to the loft level of the barn where the warm, soft hay was stored. She was almost delirious with fatigue, and she knew it was time for bed. She laid her head upon a makeshift pillow, and her eyelids immediately shut, and her head leaned to the side. And then she started snoring. Moments later, Damori found herself standing at the entrance to the servants' chamber at Castle Niansvat. She stood still and pressed her ear against the splintered wooden door. There was silence on the other side, a clue that everyone was asleep. She mentally reprimanded herself for being so late, but she felt lucky that the other servants, with whom she now shared a room, were not likely to gossip about her whereabouts. Damori was welcome in areas of the castle that most other servants had never seen. She was often summoned from the servants' quarters at Mieko's request, to dine with her or accompany Mieko on a walk in the gardens. Those instances occurred less frequently now that Mieko was engaged to be married to Folsen, but it still happened occasionally. Damori eased the door open and tiptoed inside. The room was dark except for the waiting light from a single candle in the center of the room. There were 5 beds, one in each corner of the pentagon-shaped room. Hee-young, Hua-juang, and Hyo-sun occupied 3 of the beds. The 2 empty beds belonged to Damori and Eolin. Damori imagined that Eolin had been summoned to Empress Shayla's chambers for some reason. Then she heard the clank of a tin wash-basin in an adjacent room. The room was connected by a narrow brick hallway about half the length of a traditional doorway. Even the petite ladies had to turn sideways and ease their way through the passage. But it was worth it. On the other side was a room dedicated to bathing in privacy. The women appreciated the room. Damori tugged off her hood, cloak, and snatched her veil away from her face. She peeled off her rujun and tossed it beside her bed. She noticed the flickering flame of the candle reflecting on a small basin of water on a wooden table beside her bed. She splashed water on her face, wiped her face with her linen blanket, and crawled into bed slowly. Her aching muscles protested the movement, casting radiating pain through her body. She grimaced and groaned, but finally slipped her body under the linen blanket. She closed her eyes and mentally shrugged to shift the aches and pains to the back of her consciousness. She desperately wanted to sleep, but it eluded her with sore vengeance. She opened her eyes and sensed that sleep, like most things in her life, would not afford her peace on this night. Just as she had resigned to lie in bed with her eyes staring at the dancing shadows on the ceiling, Eolin moved above her and smiled. "As much as you purse your lips tight," Eolin began, "you still groan louder than a pregnant BIBI that's ready to give birth." "Forgive me, Eolin," Damori apologized. "I tried not to wake you." Eolin sat beside Damori on the bed and snatched the blanket away. "I was not asleep, I was waiting for you," she smiled. Eolin held her hands out and motioned to Damori's legs. She nodded her approval, and Eolin began rubbing her flattened palms together in rapid fashion. When the warmth had sufficiently built up between her fingers, Eolin laid her hands on the large muscles of Damori's thighs and slowly massaged. Damori groaned. The massaging motion of Eolin's hands brought welcome release from the soreness, but it was not without its own pain. "From whom do you get so much work that you come home filled with aches?" Eolin quietly asked. Damori squeezed her eyes shut to fight against the raging pain. For a moment she couldn't decide which was worse, the aches or the massage. Eolin sensed Damori's discomfort and moved her hands down to her calves and feet. "My mother, Lady Loiza, often helped Empress Shayla with her aches and pains when she was studying." She mused deeply in thought. King Kaelin would not tolerate a queen who could not defend herself. It was difficult work. "Difficult work is its own reward," Damori offered weakly. "I relish it, but not as much as I relish your bedchambers at the moment. Thank you again for allowing me to sleep with you and the others." "You are always welcome in my chamber, Damori, but you should return to Empress Shayla's bedchamber. It is where you belong." Damori shook her head. "I now feel as an outsider in that world. There is so much I want to say and do, but it is not my place. I do not believe the Queen knows what to do with me." "Life is full of change," Eolin reminded her. "We are earnestly compelled to adapt appropriately. No one knows this more than Empress Shayla. She understands far more than you give her credit for." Eolin gave Damori's toes a playful squeeze and pulled the blanket over her again. Damori closed her eyes and rolled to her side. Deep sleep was approaching rapidly. "Thank you, Eolin, you always bless me," Damori whispered. "You are eternally welcome, Princess Damori," Eolin whispered back. "Princess?" Damori mumbled to herself. "I am not a princess." As she rolled over to sleep amongst the soft hay in the barn above the horses, the soft rumble of heavy and tired breaths eased out of Damori's mouth.